bi-coastal studio Polymode, which creates poetic and research-informed design aimed at inspiring people to better themselves and improve society. They specialize in working with clients in the cultural sphere and community-based organizations, including MoMA, the Hillary Clinton presidential campaign, the Phillips Collection, Mark Bradford, the Center for Urban Pedagogy, Walker Art Center, the Wynwood Arts District Miami, the US Department of State's Bureau of Cultural Affairs, among many others. Silas describes his own practice as polymodal, from which the name of his studio and previously MFA thesis derive. It is polymodal in its output as designed artifact, research, teaching, publishing, and speaking. He currently teaches undergraduates and graduates as an associate professor of communication arts at the Otis College of Art and Design in Los Angeles, and is a graduate advisor, founding faculty, and chair emeritus at Vermont College of Fine Arts. His practice is also polymodal in the range of content that inspires it. His own experience as a queer biracial man and myriad experiences of his clients and students. He has likened his practice of design to making something, assembling narratives from these diverse fragments of observed and lived experience. Munro's scholarly research addresses the relationship between designers, personal identities, formal systems, and strategies they utilize, and how both interact with the communities they serve. In workshops and lectures, he addresses post-colonial relationships between design and marginalized communities and offers practical ways for educators and practitioners to decolonize the way design is taught and to create inclusive new frameworks. His design work and writing has been published in Germany, Japan, Korea, the US, and the UK, including Chronicle Books, Idea Magazine, and Slanted Magazine. In the past year, he emerged as one of the most exciting practitioners of community engaged design, as well as an influential scholar known for his contributions to W.E.B. Du Bois' Data Portraits, Visualizing Black America, a publication by Princeton Architectural Press in late 2018. The project has been featured in articles ranging from the Smithsonian Magazine to the New Yorker to Black Perspectives, published by the African American Intellectual History Society. Silas is a creator who looks with a watchful eye at our shared experience. He reassembles what he gleans as important into narratives that speak back to society with vulnerability, intellectual curiosity, and great empathy. It's fitting that the title of his talk tonight is Bearing Witness, a designer's struggle for integrity. We are so very grateful to have him with us tonight. Before I hand over the rest of the evening to Silas, I want to take a moment to thank the Freund family who has made this Freund Family Design Lecture at the Sam Fox School of Design and Visual Arts possible. Natalie Edison Freud was an art supporter and community volunteer and deeply committed to the Washington University community and the arts community of St. Louis. Natalie and her husband, Henry Freud, funded the Freund Fellowship Program, a collaboration between the university and the St. Louis Art Museum. Natalie attended Washington University and was a long-term member of the Sam Fox School National Council. Her son, Michael, is also a member of the National Council and is actively involved with the Freund Fellowship Program. We want to thank the members of the Freund family who sponsor this annual lecture. And now, without further ado, I hand you over to Silas Munro.
Wow. Oh my gosh. Chrissy, thank you so much. I'm like about to tear up. That was like one of the most beautiful introductions I've ever been given. I'm kind of blushing right now. I just wanted to thank you for inviting me. Thank you to the Freund family and everyone else at Sam Fox for having me to give this lecture and virtual visit that'll continue for the next week or so. I also wanted to shout out Aggie Toppins, who is the new chair of design and design ally and friend. And thank you so much to Ben Keel and Jesse Regan. Ben is on your faculty. The two of them, with their type design studio XYZ, are designing this typeface called Polymode Sands. And Ben made this really beautiful animation, which I feel like is very polymodal and shifting, and sort of speaks to a lot of things that I'm gonna talk about. So before I begin, I just want to make a land acknowledgement. I'm beaming into you from the unceded lands of the Chumash, Tonga, and Kitsch people, which we now know as Inglewood, which is a neighborhood that's south central-ish in Los Angeles. And, you know, giving this talk after the recent revolutions around Black Lives Matter movements sparked by George Floyd's murder this summer has created a different resonance for me when I speak, adding this long list of Black people who have been murdered because of systemic racism. Police brutality has been heavy for me. So I've just been feeling emotional in general. I know there's so much happening in the world, but I wanted to give myself and you all permission to accept just feeling the feels. and for me, design is an emotional act, that there's a sensory quality to all that we're feeling, and that shows up in form. And so I'm really honored to share this research and work with you. And there were a couple people, speaking of grief, that I just wanted to acknowledge as I continue with this talk. And that's one, a dedication to my father, Stephen Burford Munro. He passed away suddenly in April. He was the editor and producer at National Public Radio for 34 years. And he really taught me a lot about this notion of integrity. And I miss him dearly. And it's times like this with so much grief and loss, and like loss on top of loss, that I remember he would just say he was proud of me. And I aim and hope to do him justice. And my dad actually, in fact, died on April 19th, 2020, which is actually the 1-year anniversary of my wedding to my husband, Bill. And the wedding was a small wedding. It was just our parents and our 2 dogs. Our moms served as the ring bearers, and our fathers served as witnesses. This was at the county clerk of Riverside and Palm Desert. And that idea of witness and the synchronicity of his passing and this very special day for me and my partner had me wondering, what does it mean to be a witness? And what does it mean to bear witness? And often in times of doubt, I reach for my ancestors and their wisdom. As part of my grieving process, I'm reading this book called Ancestral Medicine by Dr. Daniel Foer. In his book about connecting to those we have lost, he suggests connecting to our quote unquote well ancestors. Foer writes, well ancestors are true ancestors who are now sources of support, love, and guidance for the living. They are the beloved dead, people whom you would feel instinctively safe if they were paying a visit to your children or standing at the foot of your bed while you slept. They may have colorful personalities, but they are rooted in love and strongly connected to other well ancestors. And so tonight I feel guided by those well ancestors to speak to you. And it's funny because normally I would run the speech and like the script by my dad, because he would help me edit it. And he actually helped edit all the text in the Du Bois book. So I'll just call his spirit in. And speaking of also spirits, in the queer community of which I'm a member, we have this notion of a chosen family. And one of my other chosen ancestors is the novelist, author, poet, historian, and cultural critic, James Baldwin. And that's actually where the title of the talk comes from. It's a term that comes from him. And he performs a kind of alchemy through which he transforms his own pain and marginalization as a queer man of color into this like universal language of the American project. And it was actually in the fall of 1962 that Baldwin gave a lecture at Community Church in New York City entitled The Artist's Struggle for Integrity, which I adapted. And speaking of public radio, the speech was broadcast on WBAI in New York. And in the talk, Baldwin grapples with defining terms like artist or integrity or courage or nobility. He sees the artist or poet or designer struggle as one all humans face. I'm not interested really in talking to you as an artist. It seems to me that the artist's struggle for his integrity must be considered as a kind of metaphor for the struggle, which is universal and daily of all human beings on the face of this globe to get to become human beings. And then he also concludes that the artist or designer has this special dilemma. And what they face is the crime of which you discover slowly you are guilty is not so much that you are aware, which is bad enough, but that other people see that you are and cannot bear to watch it because it testifies to the fact that they are not. You are bearing witness helplessly to something which everybody knows and nobody wants to face. And so that idea is very much in this polymodal project that Chrissy mentioned in that amazing introduction. And that polymodal means like many styles, many ways of being. It was the title of my MFA thesis at CalArts. And here I'm showing a few videos from a durational performance piece that I did in 2016 called Leap Year, where I gave myself the constraint and challenge to make a video about my life every day. It was a daily practice where I wanted to connect with making more motion, looking at myself. What does it mean to perform? What does it mean to be in a body? So between depicting palm trees in Los Angeles to pre-COVID times, this is the quad of Otis College of Art and Design, where I advise undergrads and grad students, and I'm doing Tai Chi, which is something that I would do between classes, which now feels like we're just hopping from one Zoom to another. So this, I think, idea of being embodied as a person, as a designer, is something that I really come back to and speaks and shows up in a lot of my work. And the performances were also tied to what was happening in the world. So at the time I was going back and forth between Ohio and Miami. So I can relate to this idea of Washington University being in St. Louis. People get confused. I was like at Miami University in Ohio, but going back to Florida. And after the Pulse nightclub, I just was like distraught. And I, in the videos, tried to find ways to like process that. And so for me, the fact that there were these people murdered in the safest possible space for a queer person in a club, for me, I really did this, needed to do this morning dance. And in the dance, I'm using a flag, which is like iconography that's used in gay nightlife and tea dances. And it's made by my friend Steve, who has made a series of flags, but they're the Pride version of the state flag. So this is the Florida Pride state flag. And so for me, like when I'm going to the classroom or going to my studio or a client meeting, this idea of carrying a certain embodiment that has a certain perception of maybe like strength or vulnerability, or also stereotyped in certain ways or profiled, is something that really has me encouraging vulnerability in my students and to sort of find their own path through their work as designers. And that includes graduate students that advise at this low residency MFA program in Vermont, which is interesting because normally we meet in person for a week in October and April. And for the last 2 residencies, we've been doing these remote residencies. And it's wild to sort of think of this distance learning experience that we were piloting, and a lot of people were like, well, how are you going to have a great educational experience in design and if you're not physically together? And it feels like sort of a little bit of poetic justice that like it's been actually very easy for us to transition, those of us who teach at other institutions, to this new reality where we're all low residence, we're all synchronous and asynchronous away from each other? And how do you create that feeling spirit of connection and humanity? This is images of that thesis of Polymode, which was this thing where I was able to articulate a perspective on how to be a designer that wasn't attached to a specific personal style. And it also really has influenced my teaching and pedagogy. In fact, this became a project called Alter Ego, because in the thesis, I created 4 fictionalized personas. There was Jan Buffman, who's this bodybuilding graphic designer, Parabola Munabi, a biracial graphic designer, Dr. Montgomery Gabriel, a botanist, and Benjamin Jari, who is this pataphysicist named after Alfred Jari, which pataphysics is the science of the absurd. And it became this space where I could take on fiction as a way to invent like a future self. And it's been amazing how so much synchronicity from this project has ended up in projects that I do today. So for all the students that are working now, I highly encourage you to really allow yourself to play, allow yourself to investigate and go deep into your work in a way that may surprise you, that may seem absurd or not what you expect, but it can really transform who you are. And that thesis became the studio, which started off as just me and my best friend, Brian Johnson, who went to RISD with me. We met as undergrads, like in the quad. Brian was wearing a tiny little Boy Scout uniform that he had hacked and put patches on. And I think his hair was like magenta at the time. It's funny that like now I'm the one with dyed hair, but that kismet of having a believing mirror to collaborate with, I say, even if you don't formally have partnerships in your creative practice, I highly recommend it as a source of stability and insight. And because of this joy and play and poetic research, we've now created a studio as family, which is a motto that we learned really from our work with Mark Bradford. He was such a generous collaborator and boss and artist that it really showed us how to really support each other. And we're very interested in the studio and looking at non-capitalistic ways of organizing. We really are interested in transparency in the process, and also looking at fair forms of financial compensation. Of course, I also have our little interns, Jordy and Nico, down in the corner, but that's Randa and Michelle. And then Audrey doesn't have a picture, but she's like this glue for the studio. And kind of going back in time, this was the first project that Brian and I collaborated on together for the MoMA, which is about the painter Jacob Lawrence, who painted a very influential series of paintings that are very graphic and to me really speak and really should be included in the canon of design history, I believe, because of their documentary nature. They're also a series of 60 panels that were made in 1941. And they document this migration of people of color from the South to escape Jim Crow, to engage and live in these urban centers of Black progress, including New York, Harlem, Chicago, St. Louis, many other cities. Working on this project was really the beginning of this idea of how to get the materials and choices within graphic design to evoke or connect to not only this content that's related to art, but also social justice. And Jacob Lawrence and this idea of migration, we set up this logic of display type having this kind of mirroring or migration across the spread. It's set in a typeface called Eames Sans, which, although it's a contemporary 21st century typeface, evokes back to this sort of mid-century typographic aesthetic that was, alive at the time of Lawrence's work. And one of the things that we find really powerful for us is not only the design work that we're making and making an exhibition catalog that works for visual art, but also this is the first time we made a playlist for working on the project. And because Brian and I worked remotely before it was like cool and terrible to be on Zoom all the time, we would make playlists for each other so that we could be in this sort of same space and time of the creative process. And so a lot of the music here was related to Miles Davis and the blues. And we were looking at a lot of the connection between activist graphics, and Jacob Lawrence was very heavily involved with activism with his 305 group that also included his wife, Gwendolyn, and many other figures that came out of the Harlem Renaissance. He's sort of like a baby of the Harlem Renaissance movement. And in addition to the paintings, Elizabeth Alexander, who was a poet laureate at the time, commissioned 10 other Black poets to write a poem in response to the migration series. And so the book had to work both as this coffee table book, but also have this separate subgrid for like a chapbook, and had to be able to hold space for a poem that was 3 lines, like a Rita Dove poem, or like Tahimba Jess's poem, which is very expressive and overlapping and layered. And that Lawrence project really kind of set this parameter for how we would make a book project and how we would really dive deep into this idea of research and process, and how important it is for us to set the stage of materiality, of context in all of our design decisions. And, you know, meeting Mark and working on this project was like just this really profound moment of transformation, not only because I had this possibility model of this amazing, articulate, gentle, but powerful, honest visual artist who happened to be Black and gay. And his work for the Venice Biennale, for him, was something that was really challenging him to approach. And one of the things that he did with, when you win the commission to do the Venice Biennale, you get a pretty nice budget. And so one of the things that he felt challenging about creating work in this pavilion, if you've ever been to Venice, or if you ever get to go, the architecture of the American Pavilion is this Jeffersonian neoclassical building, which, you know, has this lineage of slavery. One of the essays by the African-American history historian Peter Hudson talks about this sort of Jeffersonian architecture. And what Mark did for his installation is actually make the viewer go through the side door. And he used his money from Venice to actually make a 1-to-1 scale mock-up of the pavilion, but out of like very humble materials, and was able to sketch and make work in the space, almost like what his metaphor that he said was like, when you're at home and you've got your hairbrush and you've got your favorite song on, you're like singing into the mic. It was kind of a way for him to kind of play in the space. And for us, that meant both representing and referring to the verticality and landscape of Los Angeles and the urban grid that he references in his paintings, but also to the inscriptional lettering of Venice. And so portrait inline, the sans serif became this way of connecting these different layers of time, and also speaking to typography that referenced this idea of the brutality of the cycle of Black reconstruction, destruction that Mark was looking at his work. And he put spreads in collaboration with us of images of this kind of Black reconstruction that started with the backlash against post-Civil War reconstruction, which is highlighted by W.B. Du Bois in his famous book, Black Reconstruction, the Tulsa Black Wall Street bombing in the 1920s, Watts riots in Los Angeles, the Rodney King beating, Katrina, So there's these kind of constant cycling that then also comes in the material form of his work, his paintings and sculpture, some of which are inspired by his time working in his mom's hair salon. The paintings are relaxed end papers that came from him doing Black women's hair growing up. And his work and this body of work talks a lot about the vulnerable Black body and the impacts that systemic racism and other forms of oppression have impacted particularly Black women and queer Black bodies to feel safe in the world. Here's a spread where it's an essay that Anita Hill wrote for the catalog, and the two of them have become like very close, and she gives an amazing read on his work. Additionally, there's an interview, which is interesting because there's these like pull quotes, which very much connected literally to the Polymode publication, where I was interviewing myself through the help of a classmate in character. And so there's these synchronicities kind of between my schoolwork and then what happens in the professional world. And these are also the digital and printed expression of the identity, which for me is also part of this polymodal quality, is like, how do you get an aesthetic or a visual language to translate into other medium or other forms? That's one of the most exciting things about design right now, is how many different ways that we can connect and shape space and communicate. And in some ways, you know, for what we can take or leave from the internet, there's a lot of power in this idea of being able to communicate something over distance. And so how do you translate an identity into these horizontal and fluid spaces after, like, you know, the more portrait form of a book? And so speaking of synchronicity, this idea of seeing Du Bois in Mark's book. In fact, when we were working on the book, Katie, the curator, sent us images. This was around the time of when these diagrams that Du Bois, W.B. Du Bois created, who's more known as a historian, activist, sociologist, that's how he was trained, made these amazing information diagrams, and they had been digitized by the Library of Congress. And Kathy was like, should we put these in Mark's book? And they didn't feel right for that. And then fast forward about a year, I got this invitation to be one of the authors of this book, W.E.B. Du Bois Data Portraits Visualizing Black America. And it really opened my eyes to, once again, this sort of like segment of design history that like I never learned in school. like I didn't know there was a collectively authored group of Black designers in 1900 making these amazing graphic abstractions. They're 63, 22 by 28 inch designs. Are all one-offs. They're made with gouache, which is interesting considering that like my understanding of placa or gouache in graphic form comes from Switzerland from the 1960s. But actually this predates that by 60 years, also predates the Bauhaus by 19 years, and predates Russian constructivism and De Stijl. So this idea of when you start opening up what is known within the conversation of what graphic design is, or who is a designer, or what designer might be influential, it's important to note that the exhibition, this is the exhibition design, which is super complex and interactive. There's these haptic signs that have instructions for fairgoers to view and interact with not only these diagrams, but photographs of Black life, books, patents, novels. There's also the sculpture of Frederick Douglass in the bottom left-hand corner. There were 30 million people who came to this World's Fair. At that time, Kandinsky would have been 19. So I don't know, maybe he saw this before going to the Bauhaus. And so that basically, when I discovered that and was writing this book, my wig was flipped basically about this notion of, well, what does this mean, or what are the implications for how we can reconsider design history? And so I'm going to play a little clip of Du Bois talking about the time when he was at Atlanta University. This is him as an older man in his 60s, where he's being interviewed by Moses Ashe, who's an amazing biographer. And while the plays, you can look at, these are the two main plates of two sets of diagrams that his students did the sociological research on, but also did the design.
In 1897, I went to Atlanta University and stayed there 13 years, making a systematic study of the American Negro, which wasn't well done because we didn't have money enough or personnel to carry it out. But nevertheless, it's fair to say that for the next 25 years, there wasn't a book published on the Negro problem that didn't have to depend upon what we were doing at Atlanta University. It was the first study of the sort. Ours was the first institution in the United States, white or black, that had any course on the history of the American Negro or on Negro history in general. So that it was a good beginning. But while I was there, my faith in knowledge as a solution of the Negro problem was shaken. Lynching was common. Before I went away from there, there was an average of one lynching every week for some years. And it was a terrible sort of thing. There was one case very near Atlanta in which I knew from my studies just what had happened. It was a case of a Negro peasant not receiving his wages at the end of the season. He got in a fight with his hirer and killed him and ran away. And then when they couldn't find him, they raised the altogether new issue that he had raped the man's wife, which was evidently just dragged in. Well, I had a letter which I hadn't delivered to Joel Chandler Harris, the author of the Uncle Remus tales. He was then on the Atlanta Constitution. So I took that letter and started downtown to deliver it to him and to talk to him about this situation. And on the way down, I found that this Negro, Sam Hose, had been caught and lynched, and that in the meat market, which was on the way I had to pass, his fingers and toes were being exhibited. Well, I didn't deliver the letter. I went back to Atlanta University. And then I made up my mind that knowledge wasn't enough. That even if people were ignorant of essential matters which they had to know, they wouldn't correct their actions without more realization of just what the difficulties were. They had not only to know, but they had to act.
So this disturbing image of Black violence was this catalyst for Du Bois to move away from just like rationalizing things intellectually, but acting. And I think for him, this idea of graphic design and exhibition design was a form of visual action and activism. And so after working on that, I really had to rethink how I was teaching design history and question how it was taught to me, which mainly and can still remain a lot of places, an exercise in stringing up this modernist celebrity clothesline of designers, mainly from Europe and America, mainly men, mainly white, cis designers that kind of form this like European modernist secret handshake. And for me, even just that concept of a linear progression, which I know is important for certain understandings of time didn't make sense to me. So for me, I like this idea of something more relational, this idea that we're influenced by our lineages, by the people that we're taught by. So we can sort of think of Herbert Bayer, maybe, and Walter Gropius as teacher and pupil at the Bauhaus. Of course, I'm like emphasizing these sort of like very, very German Swiss things that tend to be emphasized in curriculum that don't have to be. But, you know, Joseph Mueller-Brockmann and Max Bill never really taught together, but were contemporaries of each other and sort of in the same orbit. You could sort of think of the same thing as Karl Gerstner and Armin Hoffman as colleagues at Basel. And then you can kind of have your own chosen family. Like I can choose Elaine Leroy-Locke, who coined the Harlem Renaissance as a Black queer man who also is very involved in creating a design aesthetic of the Harlem Renaissance. I can choose Du Bois, I can choose, you know, other people that are contemporary. But one of the things that I really want to also add is thinking about hierarchy of ideas. And so if you suddenly introduce or reintroduce what's missing, particularly as Du Bois and his students being innovators of aesthetics we commonly think of as related to isotype, which is in the bottom left-hand corner, comes out of Vienna in the 30s and 40s. Otto Neurath and his wife Marie and Garrett, they had a third collaborator, De Stijl in the corner, Herbert Bayer. You suddenly have to reconfigure what's considered minor, major, what should take up space in a curriculum, because I know this practically as a teacher, like there's only a certain number of weeks in a semester. But this can now have cascading implications, which it's really interesting to show this diagram, which I've made several years ago. And now we're kind of hearing all these voices talk about decolonizing and shifting curriculum, where it's not possible to talk about the streamlining and design thinking and the beginning of human factors without thinking about racism, redlining, and the Victor Hugo Green Negro Motorist book. And you can't think about the Eames Aluminum Group, which came out in 1968, without talking about I Am a Man, which was a set of signs made by Black sanitation workers or commissioned by a local printer, worn on their chests when they were protesting the lack of fair pay and choosing not to pick up trash, marching for their lives literally days before Martin Luther King is assassinated. And this idea of something Du Boisian connects to other design projects. I've had the great fortune to work on an exhibition called Great Force, which took the typographic reference of Du Bois and has been digitized by Trace Seals into this typeface called William, which is a beta. I think he's getting ready to release it, where again, we kind of go back to this metaphor of the gutter. This is for an exhibition of contemporary art, of contemporary artists questioning notions of race at Virginia Commonwealth University. And the gutter becomes this force, and the color from Du Bois' plates reference this notion of like, how do we question racism? Like even the cover is like, almost looks like a slice of cherry pie. Like what's more racist? What's more American, racism or cherry pie? And this idea of questioning that. And again, James Baldwin comes to mind because that actual title of the exhibition comes from his quote about the great force of history being something that we're always contending with, that we're always coming back to. And that works its way through the logic of the book design, where these Du Boisian rules are interacting and serving as the armature for footnotes, for figures, and punctuating illustrations in the scholarly essays that were led by this amazing team by the curator Amber Acevia. We also had this section of reprints that included texts from Baldwin, Frederick Douglass, who actually is the one who first used the term color line that Du Bois then propagates. And they were in a series of different typefaces and different measures that were referencing these different points in time. And then we also had multiple shades of white in the book as a way to kind of preface and make visible this notion of whiteness as not being a default. At the same time, it is an artist catalog, and so some of these heavier design moves get quieter in the artist sections, where the line just becomes like one thin rule that also connects the lightweight, and you have these italic and back italics pushing their force coming from the gutter. One of the amazing opportunities that came out of this project was us being able to also design diagrams for artists who are doing research. And part of our own research and play, we adapted the Du Boisian aesthetic for artists like Kevin Beasley, who works with cotton. So we made a map of cotton belt states, or Tamashi Jackson was making work about Confederate monuments that are still up to today. And this was made like, about a year before all the things that went down in Richmond this summer, but it was very much a portend of this need to question the markers of the history of our country. And I just feel really grateful to be able to participate in design and collaborate with institutions that are willing to help us question our existence through art, through design, through dialogue. And a lot of the times we are doing lots of collaboration. Good design does not happen in a vacuum. A lot of the work for ICA came in the form of this kit of parts that was given to the design team, who helped generate amazing social media graphics, exhibition graphics, other printed ephemera. And speaking of lineages, we just keep finding these amazing influences in our work for this exhibition for Willie Smith, who's basically Virgil Abloh before Virgil Abloh in the 70s and 80s was this super successful fashion designer who patented streetwear that was affordable, accessible, who unfortunately died early from AIDS in 1987. His business had brought in over $25 million at the height of its import. He had showrooms across the world and was also very much an interesting collaborator, collaborating with folks like Keith Haring, Bill T. Jones, Arnie Zane. And he really, through his collaborations, broke down social, cultural, and economic boundaries, embracing utilitarian, inexpensive, and customizable fashion. And in the catalog, there's just this rich amount of material, both of scholarly essays, but also remembrances of people who knew him. And one of the things that I want to read as I'm showing you these images is we were also asked to write an essay about designing the exhibition and catalog called Design for Willie Smith. In 1999, when we were just entering college, the World Health Organization estimated that 14 million people had died of AIDS, 500,000 of those in the United States. They were friends and fathers, sons and daughters. They were able teachers, leaders, creators, and guides. Our young minds were still grappling with what it meant to be sexual beings, let alone what it meant to be gay. We had to process the profound anxiety surrounding unsafe sex, the terror that being gay equaled death by AIDS. At the time, we observed the public crash of the first wave, MTV, Benetton, Ryan White and the AIDS quilt, Magic Johnson and Keith Haring. We did not know that when we grew older, we would have a shortage of mentors. In the trove of human and cultural queer existence, where was the light in the dark, the hermit holding the lamp of truth, the disco ball illuminating our radiant and sweaty frames? Who will hold that space? We felt the absence. Who do we talk to? How do we handle this fire hydrant of feelings? Why do the taboos feel so good? When will the shame go away? How will we transmute this anger into art? Ghosts don't answer. They haunt, linger, and fade. When Cooper Hewitt approached us to create a graphic identity and typographic system to communicate Willie Smith's ingenious, multivalent, and complex body of work, we saw an opportunity to honor a design ancestor's legacy. This has been one of our studio's most challenging, inspiring, and heart-healing projects to date. Smith excelled at collaborating with discipline crossing visionaries that define genre by manipulating text, image, and material form. In the beginning stages of our research, we were especially drawn to Willie Ware's collaborations with Dan Friedman and Bill Bonnell. Friedman was one of the few queer designers referenced by a largely heterosexual faculty. His dynamic typographic experiments reflected both the rational lineage of the Bauhaus and an upstart postmodern approach. The wild graphics and interior design Friedman designed for Willie Ware upended societal expectation of corporate branding in space by embracing a queer sensibility. Similarly, Bill Bonnell's work for Willie Ware captured the brand's explosive creativity within the still traditional fashion system. The poster for Bonnell's landmark exhibition, Postmodern Typography, Recent American Developments, introduces visual design that uses typography not only to inform, but to express. Type that explains an idea and in cases almost visually becomes the idea. And so this idea of channeling that ethos into this design concept of balancing this playful tension of practicality and individual expression for everyday living. And so we ended up using this typeface designed by Joshua Darden, who is one of the few Black type designers and also happens to be queer, as a kind of like a workhorse utilitarian typeface that was in counterpoint to these very fragmentary, expressive, sculptural spaces that were designed by site architects who designed Willie's original showrooms, and almost had to be this kind of like rhythmic, expressive, but balanced analog to all the material in the exhibition. And that was also translated into a community online archive, which actually became super useful during the COVID pandemic because the show, we finished designing it. And basically it was open for 2 days and then has been closed since. And so by having this space where basically the book was published online for free that people could access and read the book, as well as contribute their own stories to the history of Willie Smith. And so this idea of like collective authorship, accessibility, are all themes that connect to our work. And that's something that I continue to be interested in design history. This is a diagram that Alfred Barr made. He was the first founder of the MoMA, which kind of ties back to Jacob Lawrence, who originally had his migration series shown there and was purchased by MoMA, where we've created, as a studio, Polymode, a queer parody of the bar diagram, which has opened up this entire space of research, you know, from antiquity into the present day, and has allowed us to zoom in and focus on various parts of this queer design history. Most recently, I've been working on looking at publications from the Harlem Renaissance and how queerness and Blackness has created this kind of Art Deco aesthetic that connect us back to a sort of thing now that feels very contemporary and important, but also came out of this very interesting mix of both queer and straight and Black and white designers and artists that influence each other. And so what I like about doing this research and telling the story of these publications is that our design histories, although they can be fraught, are also more complex and not so binary. And I just want to close the talk with a section about this idea of embodiment that I called in at the beginning, and this idea of having projects that sort of connect to our humanness in our flesh. The first of which is a new identity that we've been working with a nonprofit in Orange County that has been helping K through 12 students deal with this pandemic and help them support emotional resiliency. This is You and, or Tu Más, which is going to be rolling out starting next month. And it is a visual identity that came out of looking at sacred geometry and this idea of like, how do you visualize hope or joy, or this idea of emotional resiliency or transformation. And we created this system of color and shapes that focus on these 6 levels of lesson, which start from you and COVID and move to you and tools, you and community, you and mind, body, and spirit. And has just been this amazing process of putting a polymodalness into various forms. This is the Figma prototype for the mobile app, which is in development. And I just love seeing all the connections and the sort of process that can come through when we make design. Here are screens from the application. We've worked on motion graphic templates for these various age groups so that the identity flexes to someone in kindergarten as well as someone in high school. And now we're starting to work on social media, out of home, and it just feels really good to actually use design skills to help people dealing with the very reality of today. And I'm just going to show you like a little bit of that animation motion for level.
Hi, I'm Megan. Today we're going to talk about you and your feelings. Last time we discussed how much COVID-19 has changed our world. You're likely feeling different too. COVID-19 is bringing up a lot of stuff for everyone. It could be new feelings from the stress of navigating change, or old feelings that are coming up even stronger. Either way, this is a great time to explore your feelings, even the difficult ones, and learn how to manage stress. As a high school student, you're more aware than ever of the world around you. You're feeling it all, navigating school, friendships,
and so this idea of like building a world of color, shape, and form that can actually be soothing is something that feels really healing and exciting. I'm just going to show the like kind of end of how that geometry kind of.
And remember, we still have a whole world to explore together. See you next time. Till then, feel those feelings. You got it.
It's interesting how this like personal video work has led to doing more motion as a studio. This is a lecture series that's totally digital because of COVID that has posters of 4 African-American artists that are presenting at Rice University in Houston. And basically the brief that we sort of gave ourselves in talking to the artists that were commissioning us was this idea of like, what if Willem Crowell was Black, the sort of famed Dutch designer, and sort of bring this idea of motion, typographic rigor, but also the sense of space and Afrofuturism. And that includes video that is silent, but then with the permission of some of the artists, we also were able to embody their voice or their sonic expression as part of the campaign.
I was becoming increasingly invested in looking at the youth of America. My name is Nicole Miller. I'm an artist. I often work in video installation, sculpture, and now laser light installation.
And so we've been calling this like a kind of benevolent howl, benevolent Black howl, that's like speaking the truth of these artists' voices.
I'm interested in geometry, I'm interested in abstraction, and I'm interested in locating a place through intuition, through composition, through organization in the making of the work that like holds the narrative in such a way that it can be felt and not necessarily didactically told.
Be self-quoted.
the last thing I'll leave you with is a surf report. Part of one of the things that I've been doing during isolation to stay sane, and this is something I was doing before, I think those of us who are educators or designers or students, we're all kind of having all these different hats on all at once. And I think for me, one of the ways that I get integrity is to connect to my body. And so actually, after losing a pretty big client a few summers ago, who I guess basically I didn't kiss their ass enough, I actually like went on this like rageful kick of like, I wanted to surf. I've been wanting to surf for years. And I just basically took all the money that I made for the project and just like burned it into surf lessons and started documenting this process of learning how to surf. And that to me came to head and became integrated with me as an activist. The rest of the images here are pictures and video of a paddle out that happened this summer on Breonna Taylor's birthday at Inkwell Beach in Santa Monica, which used to be the historically black beach where only people of color, that's the only place they could be in the water. And in Hawaiian and surf and Polynesian tradition, when a surfer is drowned or lost at sea or dies in some other way, there is a community gathering where we hold council in the water, surfers paddle out, drum on their surfboards, chant, do call and response, and often bring a lei or flower to memorialize the loss of life. And for me, I saw more Black surfers than I'd ever seen before in my life. And I just had this feeling from people of all backgrounds. There were parents and kids and people of all ages and colors and backgrounds. And there was just this feeling of connectedness, of hope and joy, and just the way that people were talking to each other, you know, after this, of course, like from a healthy distance, were just like one of the most profound experiences of my life. And it just felt like this powerful moment where all aspects of me came together, and I just felt welcomed, and I felt understood, and I felt known. And I just wanted to close with that. I have like one more piece at the end, but I think I'm just going to skip that because I think we're kind of like at time. Chrissy, what do you think? Should we go to Q&A, or should I show this like short video at the end?
I think you should show it. It would be a tease to not see it now, but maybe we can just have a few minutes for Q&A at the end.
Sorry, I got into it.
No, it's great. We're into it too.
Okay. All right. So the last thing that I kind of want to leave you with is like this mix of like hope and also kind of like I just been having blues about design and being a design educator. And so I've never done this before, so bear with me, but I made a song that speaks to this idea of like blues, but also tries to not take myself too seriously. So I leave you with Design School Blues at the end here. Design School Blues. Tuition is a hike and teacher don't be liking the debt keep on mounting. Committee don't like me, they say my style old fashioned. No tenure put out to pasture. Rank and promotion, but only for the doting. But do you really like me? Would you rather bite me? Please, ma'am, cite me as the color in the room. Tuition is a hiking, teacher don't be liking the debt keep on mounting. The AIGA done asked me to sit up on that jury, diversely including. The provost done asked me to harshly judge your C-fee. Chair that fucking panel, oops, don't curse on this line. Max out on my credit lines. Lord, these design school blues. Tuition is a hiking, teacher don't be liking that debt keep on mounting. I'm overriding students, don't you think it prudent? Can't pay these conference dues. Maybe I'll get commission with your cultural permission. More lines for my CV. Why don't you join my channel? Follow the latest scandals. See the design school blues. Tuition is a hiking, teacher don't be liking that debt keep on mounting. And if you wanna sue me, I'm at the book fair tabling. I'm at my laptop slaving. Sign it on my poster, your print as property. So, read so my lips. Lord, with all these trials and tribulation dues, I'm paying in excess them design school blues. Tuition is a hiking, teacher don't be liking that debt keep on mounting. Vote of no confidence, zooming without my pants in the classroom with the parents. Budget cut, it's apparent. Did you get your COVID test? Posting homework on the CMS. My hair looks like a crow's nest. So many sleepless nights, I put Red Bull in my Sprite. More like cold brew tonight. Designing type high as a kite. I've got DEI fatigue, all these design celebrities. Who's up in my league? But only if you qualify me as the color in the room. Tuition is a hiking, teacher don't be liking that debt keep on mounting. Who wants a teacher's union? Pajamas is my new suitin'. While I smoke a Cuban, make the college mutant. Sign up for my webinar, aren't we all at war now? He, they, preferred pronouns. I can't hear you, damn it, Susan. Oh, my bad, you on mute now. Tuition is a hiking, teacher don't be liking that debt keep on mounting. Staff being a furlough, zooming from my bed, voices in my head. News cycles on repeat, I can't catch a beat, murders in my street. Black Lives Mattering, another day in the ring. Decolonize the curriculum. Oh, you want a refund? How about you defund that popo, that stop and frisk, the rubber bullet punches in my stomach. All these budget crunchings, administration out to luncheons. Will I, Lord, with all these trials and tribulation dues, I'm paying in excess them design school blues. Lord, those design school blues. Thank you. Thanks for letting me show that.
Oh my goodness, I can't believe we almost did not see that. That was amazing.
Thanks.
That and the rest of your talk was just so timely, Silas. Thank you so very much. I know there's a lot of eager folks in the audience who had some questions. So in the interest of time, I'm wondering if we could just share a few of those.
Yeah, totally.
Okay.
To chat some of them, if that helps or whatever. Yeah, let me know.
The first question we had is from a member of the Sandfox community, Liz Kramer. She had two ancestors questions from the beginning of your talk. What was the name of the book you mentioned?
I'm going to put this, all panelists and attendees. It was called Ancestral Medicine.
Okay. And how have these projects and collaborations changed your ideas about ancestors and your role as a future ancestor?
Wow. I think that's a great question, Liz. I really think it's funny. I actually had a tarot reading actually a couple weeks before my dad passed. And there was like actually all this like familial love in the reading. And one of the things, and the tarot reader is a really good friend of mine, Sarah Faith Godsteiner, who writes books about the moon and moonbeaming and magic, which are amazing. But she was really asking me like, what do you want your legacy to be? And that made me think, and it wasn't not necessarily just who you directly affect, but think about the people that are affected by the people you affect. And so this idea of like, you know, a design student in, you know, 2 or 3, or in indigenous practices, they say 7 generations finds, you know, my work, I'm starting to think about like, oh, like, how do we make something sustainable? How do I make something that has impact, that's generative, that's positive, but that's also real?
Great. We have another question from one of our students that's asking, what are ways you would recommend going about researching and educating yourself on design history outside of the linear canon we're taught in school? This comes from Kirsten Holland, who's a senior at Sam Fox.
Well, Kirsten, you could ask your new colleague, Aggie. She has a lot of really great research, you know, about this. But I think it's just keeping an open mind. I think doing a lot of self-learning, self-studying. There's actually this really amazing group called Design History Friday that I and Louise Sandhouse help organize, where a bunch of educators across the country, Aggie's been there, there's so many who are doing this work. One I want to spotlight is Roman Tejada, has a decolonizing design, both design history, but also design practice. And it's so good that you're really thinking about that right now as a senior, as like, sort of like, how does your practice like bridge out into the world? And just also remember that it's like, you don't need to learn it all at once, you know? Charles Eames has this essay where he talks about education as a found object. And he talks about this idea of like lifelong learning, that it's something that's like stumble upon, that we build constantly. And so I would just encourage you just to keep that open inquiry and keep asking questions.
Great. And also there's a question from Leslie Liu, who's a junior in our communication design program. She actually has a few. I'm going to start with her second question, which is there a way to design with a sustainable amount of anger towards injustice?
Yes. I think part of that is the self-care part that I was talking about. I highly recommend the writing of Adrienne Marie Brown, who is a community organizer. She has a couple books. One's called Emergent Strategy, and the new one that I'm reading is called Pleasure Activism. And what she talks about, and she's pulling in a lot of Black radical feminist thought, particularly the work of Audre Lorde about pleasure and poetry. And so what she says is that like rage, our emotions, our feelings are valid and they're powerful and they have a role in the work that we're doing. And that we also need to stoke and care for our own flames so that we don't burn out, right? And we can also use each other for support. Yeah.
Great. The first part of her question, or the first question was that first, she thanks you so much for your talk. She wondered how you feel about name dropping designers that are part of the modern canon. Is there a way to talk about design that's critical of how expertise is evaluated?
Oh, that's such a good question. You're ready for a book, Leslie. Maybe that'll be your own thesis. But I think one of the things, I name names not to drop the names, but to honor them. And so, and I cite my references, and I try to do it in a way that, yes, I have an ego. So like being associated with certain names is exciting to me, but it's also finding your kinship. I feel like that's my problem with the canon. It's not one size fits all, but it's been treated that way. I totally love Herbert Byers' work. Like, I was given a research project by Doug Scott as a sophomore, and I loved learning about him and his arc from being a designer to a painter, working in the corporate world. I mean, he has serious problems in some of his politics and ideology and design work he did when he was in Germany. But I'm also interested in the things that connect to my own lineage. Like, I would have loved to know more about design from Uganda. I would have loved to know about design from Scotland, which is where my dad's side of the family is from, or design from the Midwest, from Minnesota. Like, that wasn't really covered in my design history. So I think it's okay to scoop up some of those who are known. They're known for a reason, but I think with the temperance of really finding things that resonate for you.
So Silas, I think you might be able to see the Q&A. It's really heating up here. A number of people who love the design school blues and are wondering how they can access it and share it.
I can put it on Vimeo and maybe give you the link so that when you share the recording of this, it can be put out. I know it's on SoundCloud. One of the VCFA students put the audio on there. I don't know what tags or if I'm named, but you might be able to find it on SoundCloud if you give it a Google. But I'll definitely share a link of the video soon.
Wonderful. There's a few questions I may just share with Silas after the talk, and perhaps he can get back to us offline about that. But a few questions here. This is from Sarah Otis, a junior in our ComDes program. Silas, this was just, oh my goodness, so much love. I'm wondering what your thoughts are about designing within an anti-capitalist framework. How might we think about design as something for social revolution, not solely for consumption?
That is amazing, Sarah. I love that question. And actually, this is something I've been thinking about and like needing support myself. So actually, we decided this before COVID, but we started working with an anti-capitalist business coach named Bear Herbert, and they are amazing. And they have really transformed our way. Obviously, you have to operate within capitalism and you need capital to run a business, but we have been looking at very unique ways of shifting compensation away from the top of the partners and finding ways that even our labor can reinvest in. Like we've been doing these partner projects where like 30% after taxes goes back into Polymode's like coffers to support education, learning of designers. We really try to empower our team to start leading things, like Michelle's like starting to lead our social media, you know, Randa is like really going to help with our website. There's just ways that we're teaching and giving back to our studio. And then that's also, we're trying to do that with our clients, like radical transparency. Who do we collaborate with? What are the fees that we charge? Being very direct and open about how we practice. I'm gonna drop Bear's info in the chat if you want to know more, but there's a lot of resources out there, and it's not something that happens overnight.
Okay, a lot of great questions here. I'm not sure if we're going to be able to answer them all.
Email them. I could like get them back to people if we don't get to some of them.
Yeah. How much time do you think we have here, Silas?
I'm good. Like if people want to mosey on, I'm good to keep going.
Okay, to keep going for a little bit, but
good.
Others are free to leave, of course. We are recording this, so we can check back on it if you. As
long as you're, Chrissy, like you let me know when you're done.
Okay, I'm great. This is wonderful. Rachel Zemser is also in our communication design program. One of Du Bois' theories is the benevolent despot, in which white capitalists help uplift Black individuals. But he is not optimistic that this will truly happen, as whites' own greed and self-interest will get in the way. How can we as designers help others and ensure that our inherently self-interested capitalist self does not even get in the way? What are things that you do to mitigate that interference?
Oh, Rachel, wow, this is like $1 million question. I was trying to, I should like read it again because it's like a multi. Yeah, I think that's interesting because kind of this idea of benevolent despot is you're sort of calling in notions of neoliberalism, right? Like that the markets will correct themselves and that, you know, we can kind of like bring this sense of goodness in how we operate in capitalism, which we know is super complex. I think part of what we need to do a lot as designers, I'm just looking at your question to make sure I'm like answering properly, or to the best of my ability, is this idea of like gifting or generosity. And part of what I think about when I'm approaching a project and what I try to think about is like, how do I help out in this situation? And sometimes that means not doing anything. Sometimes I'm not meant to be in the room or in that space. And I think that's some of the things that your question is making me think about, particularly with design thinking. I highly recommend the work of Lauren Williams, who is an educator in Detroit at College of CCS there. And she's written an amazing paper called The Co-Occurrence of Neoliberalism, Racism, and Design Thinking. And then also I would point to the work of Antoinette Carroll of Creative Reaction Lab, who is now doing seminars. She's been doing this work, but seminars about the overlapping complicity of white supremacy and design thinking. And I think that's a way to hold ourselves accountable, is like to keep questioning our impulses and to try to, there's a Sister Karita quote where she talks about, and we talk about this at BCFA, where she says at the top of her manifesto, try finding a place that you trust and try trusting it for a while. So this idea of like not dropping in and dropping out, but actually sticking and staying, and ideally operating in the communities that we are also part of. Thanks, nice. Yeah, thank you for dropping Lauren's essay.
Yeah, of course. Okay, from Miles Lee, who is a student also and is a senior in our communication design program. They ask, Silas, thanks so much for talking so openly about your experiences. I love that you talked about reconfiguring the design canyon. How does the reconfiguration of the design canon fit with your teaching? Being a design faculty at Otis and elsewhere, do you feel a responsibility to mentor your students, especially those who may be Black and or queer? I imagine there are a lot of students who look up to you. How do you handle that responsibility?
Can I see that in the, that was a good question. I just want to
Yes, it was left at 7:08 p.m. by Miles.
7:08, oh, Miles. Okay, yeah, thank you so much. Wow, Miles, that's really, really powerful. So, I mean, it's a practice. It's a daily practice. It's like every class prep. I feel actually the hardest class I've been teaching this semester is the design history class, because I've been doing this work, but I just feel like it's so more vital and important. And so part of what I also try to do is practice vulnerability. And I think that can also be help me be an ally for people's experience I don't understand or don't have lived with, which include Indigenous, which include women, which include trans experiences. And so I think that is something I try to do. And then I also try to be a possibility model to other students of color, other queer students. And I do that with also letting myself be human. Like I'm not perfect. I'm still learning and doing this work myself. And I think that's the best way that I can show up is in an honest way.
That's wonderful. I think maybe the last question we'll answer live and possibly it is also from Miles. Additionally, I imagine your Black and queer identities inform your teaching, but were they part of why you got into teaching?
That's a great question, Miles. I think I got into teaching because it is in my lineage. So all of my dad's sisters were public school teachers, one for students with like additional learning needs, another like K through, like K through 2, and then another like high school. So I think that kind of like is in my DNA. And I think one of the other reasons why I got into teaching was I couldn't afford to take an unpaid design internship during the summers when I was an undergrad. And so I got a job at the Virginia Community College, and I had two amazing mentors, Esther Parentoni and Michael Van Dyke, who really taught me how to teach. And so I started as like creative computer camp counselor, but then eventually learned that I not only was good at it, but I loved it. And so it was sort of like a mix of necessity and destiny.
Okay, there's a quick question about, from L. Cohen, do you and Trey have any estimate of when William will be released?
That is a good question. He sent me a version that looked really good. And actually, I'm pretty stoked. We're going to be collaborating on another typeface that's coming out next year that is related to this protest exhibition. If you check out his Pinterest, he has this typeface equals that's like related to like signs, but I don't know. I'll ask him. I'll be like, hey, release it. It's so good, isn't it? Yeah, I think it's ready.
Let him know you did some good PR for him tonight.
Totally deserves it. He's killing it. Yeah, totally. It is cool.
Two questions relating to your practice. Specifically, Leslie Liu asks if you feel keeping the practicalities of the final deliverables in mind at the very beginning of your process limits the concept.
I don't think so. I think this like weird phrase, I think my friend Max would say this a lot, but he basically would say, if it's not practical, it's not spiritual, which I really like that. And I feel like that's part of the beauty of being a designer, is that we deal with the material realities of limitations and constraints. And I think there can be a lot of power in accepting, owning, and working with this idea of like, when's it due? I'm very deadline driven. And I think that's how I get all done that I get done, is because that idea of matching something, what is Christopher Alexander talks about this in his notes on the synthesis of form, talking about that good fit between form, function, and context. And that's design.
Okay, very last question here from senior Jefferson Dwan. And he's asking what it's like to start a studio on your own with a colleague / with a colleague. Do you just ... decide to, or did you intend to do so from the very beginning?
I knew I wanted to start a studio. And then when I did, I realized I couldn't do it by myself. And so Brian actually saved my ass, to be honest, on the MoMA project, and really became invaluable with Bradford. And so we just loved hanging out and working together. It wasn't like the plan. We're like, oh, we're going to start the studio. It was just like these amazing opportunities came to us, mainly from the generosity of other faculty and colleagues that referred us for these projects. And so we were just like, let's do this. And we've just kept at it. We just finally wrote a business plan, that's many years later. And so it's possible, so Jefferson, if there's someone that you are in school with, or someone you respect or care about, or you want to start something, go for it.
Wonderful. And I believe that's a wrap. Silas, thank you again so much. This was such a timely and thoughtful and inspiring talk. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you. It's an honor. And I look forward to hanging out with some of the folks at Sam Fox the next couple of weeks. So that's we don't have to say goodbye just yet.
Absolutely. Until later. But thank you. And thank you all for joining us tonight.